Okay, so we are at the top of the hour. Let's get this show on the road. So hello, everybody. Welcome to our 2024 Evergreen International Online Conference. Always a mouthful. My name is Gina Monti, and I am the chair of the conference committee. So thanks everyone again for attending today, and let's just get started here. So I'm just going to give typically what we do at every conference is a bit of a welcome note with some other tips, especially as we're using an online platform this time, this one being FeedLoop integrated with Zoom. It's a little bit different than what we usually do. So hopefully I could give you some good stuff here to make it more optimal for your experience. We also have our keynote, Richard Littauer, with us today. So thank you for joining us. He is the organizer of the SustainOSS and host of the Sustain podcast. We do have some sponsors. There's one error on this slide. I also like to thank Biblimation and Stack Courier for being sponsors for the keynote, but we also have Equinox, Quipu, and ECDI, which I'll get to further in our slides here. So first, I'd like to thank our conference planning committee. We are a much leaner committee this time around. So as it always is very important to have a great team behind an international online conference. Very special thanks to everybody who's been a great part of this with all the different roles that you filled out, getting our website ready, getting things ready for the conference, organizing all of you who are presenting today, etc. We couldn't have made it possible without our conference planning committee. So special thanks to Ruth, Debbie, and Jennifer. All right, so I mentioned the sponsors, and here we go. We'll be going over the sponsors for this conference. Special thanks to you, especially for being champion, advocate, and ally sponsors. So for our champion sponsors, we have our platform sponsor, which is basically sponsoring the online platform that we're using today, which is FeedLoop. So thank you, Equinox, for being a sponsor. Thank you, ECDI, the Evergreen Community Development Initiative, for also being a sponsor for the captioning services. And thank you for the Hackfest sponsor, Quipu. The Hackfest is free to register for, and we will also be providing captioning in links that we'll put throughout the chat. Our advocate sponsors, we have a bit more sponsors than usual. So special thanks to everybody who's stepped up this year and wanting to invest in our conference. For the pre-conference yesterday, we had Mobius and Stack Courier who were the advocate level sponsors for that. And sorry, Stack Courier, I meant to say Unique for our keynote today. So thank you again to Biblimation and Unique for sponsoring the keynote. Sorry, Unique. However, I was able to get you this time around. We also have an invited speaker, which is a little bit different this year. We're going to have Terry Reese, the creator of Mark Edit, joining us tomorrow. So we'd like to thank Pales/Spark PA for being the invited speaker sponsor for that. And of course, our ally sponsors, which are Bywater Solutions, CoolCat, Consortium of Ohio Libraries, and EBSCO. Thank you so much for putting in some effort also into investing in our conference as ally sponsors. All right, so just so we could get through our notes here before we start the keynote, kind of like what we did before, if you are a returning attendee, welcome back. We have used Hopin in the past, and there's going to be some similarities. And if you are a new attendee to our conference, we are very excited that this year is going to be your first conference with us. So the sessions are kind of like rooms. I did send out a guide for our registered attendees. You could also look up that link in our lobby. That's going to be underneath our announcements. So some examples of sessions are track 1 and track 2 for different programs, lightning talks, etc. And as I mentioned before, the lobby has a program schedule and other helpful links in there. We do have a very special exhibitor lightning talk today that's going to be held at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, which is also 1:30 p.m. Central and 11:30 a.m. Pacific time. This is a new thing that we're trying out. So thank you to our exhibitors for being able to do some lightning talks today, and also for taking some time to be virtually manning, so to speak, the exhibit hall booths. So please visit the exhibit halls when you can during our breaks throughout the conference. They look really nice in the FeedLoop platform. We have regular lightning talks that are going to be held tomorrow during the same time slot. I did also put in an announcement for anyone who wants to sign up. There are going to be 5-minute slots each. So you can look up the announcement in the lobby for that spreadsheet if you'd like to sign up. It is a first come, first served basis. We do have an online social hour tonight that is free and open to all. We're going to be hosting it on Zoom directly. And that's going to be 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, 4 p.m. Pacific time. And we're going to play some Jackbox games. Always a fun time doing that. And as I mentioned before, the Hack Fest is going to be held this Thursday on the 24th. It's going to be a full day event, but there is a special schedule for our interest groups. So if you also look at the lobby, there will be some information about that. Hackfest is free and open to all as well. We just ask that anyone who's interested in signing up to do like an informal registration through a Google form. It just helps us with keeping attendance numbers. All right, so feed loop, this is a new thing for us. So I hope that you like the platform. As you can see, if you are viewing it in sessions through feed loop, it mimics a lot of Zoom because it basically is a Zoom integration. So you can actually unmute yourself and start a video through the sessions, which makes it great for interest groups meeting together, any other presentations that involve some type of conversation. Just as typical etiquette is with online meetings, please mute yourself when you are not speaking or asking a question. There also is a full screen icon that's on the upper right-hand corner that might be easier for certain people to view on a bigger screen, especially if you're going to be working or rather viewing presentations that might have like terminals with those like smaller scripts. It might be helpful to use that full screen mode. So please use that icon as you see fit. You could also click on the experiencing issues, click here for additional live stream options below the video itself, and that will give you an option to view the presentation on Zoom directly. That is completely fine, and it is up to you in terms of what your options are. And lastly, you may need to turn off your ad blocker in order to get the full optimization for your browser for feed loop. I run Brave on mine, so there are times where I do need to turn off those ad blockers in order to use video and mics. Okay, so one note about the recording and captioning, most sessions will be recorded, like the keynote, pre-conference presentations from yesterday, regular conference presentations, state of the project, dev update, and lightning talks. Recordings will be publicly available on our Evergreen YouTube channel following the conference. I don't know exactly what time I'll be putting those up, but I'm hoping around June. Slides will also be posted to the program's description page of the conference website after the conference is over. Most events will be live captions. Moderators will post a link in the sessions chat when captioning becomes available. Interest groups, social events, Hackfest, and discussion rooms will not be recorded or captioned. We also have a code of conduct and a photo video policy. I'm not going to go over into it right now, but we do have links available on our website for you to view. Basically, the gist is that cameras are always optional. You don't have to use them. An alternative screen name and or avatar photo is okay within the bounds of the code of conduct. And mind your screen sharing. Don't share any chat rooms or windows, bookmarks, whatever that you don't want others seeing. And lastly, we have some social media. So one thing that did change this year is that we are going to be using Blue Sky instead of Twitter. So this might be a new username to you. That's at evergreenils.bsky.social. The hashtag for this particular conference is EVGILS24. We also have a Facebook page, and that is also the link to our YouTube. These slides as well will be posted after the conference is over. So if you need to take a look at those, you can. And before we turn over to Richard, special thanks to our presenters and attendees. I just want to go off script for one moment, just to mention that I think this year is also, well, every year is unique, but I really like to thank all those who really stepped up and wanted to present acquisitions-based presentations and cataloging-based presentations. That's a very unique thing for us this year. But of course, if you are a presenter presenting anything, the amount of people who have been in proposals was very, like, almost overwhelming this year, which is awesome. And we're seeing a lot of new faces as attendees this time around. So I really hope that you enjoy our conference for you. And again, my name is Gina. I'm actually going to be moderating the keynote. So if you have any questions for Richard, please put it in the chat. I'll put the captioning link in the chat as well. And we could get started. So let me stop screen sharing.
And could you also start screen sharing abilities? Because I don't have that enabled.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
No.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Let me make you a host then.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I am a host now. I will abuse my powers. Excellent.
Awesome.
You should just see what is sustainable open source. Is that the only thing you see?
That is the only thing I see.
Excellent. Good.
All right. Thank you.
My Pokemon Go online hack is, I'm not doing anything else. All right. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. It's very kind to be invited as a keynote. This is scary. I tried my hardest to get food poisoning and it didn't work. So here I am, which is nice. I'm realizing I can't see the chat, but I'm hoping that someone will show me if there are any questions. Feel free to ask questions throughout this. I am a very fast talker, and I will try my hardest not to do that today. I don't know how many people here are second language English speakers, and sometimes my accent is atrocious. So I'm just glad to be here. Chat. Oh, cool. I can see the chat. Excellent. So I can see the chat as well. It is good to be bad at getting food poisoning. That is correct. I'm Richard Littauer. That's already been said. And I'm going to be talking about what is sustainable open source. And instead of going forward and telling you all about myself, I'm just going to say I have slides for that. So I'm going to leave it. But again, if you have questions, if you have comments, I really appreciate feedback, live questions, because it makes me feel engaged. Just talking at a screen is very difficult for me. But I'm happy to be here. Those are some links. Note that it's HTTP, not HTTPS for richard.social, but you don't have to go to that link. I'm right here. If you want to hear me talk, just listen to me talk. All right, that didn't work. So there we go. Who is this Richard Littauer guy anyway? I have no idea. He could be my dad or his dad. But that's me there in the blue. I like this photo because it's the worst photo of me on the internet. I'm a linguist by training. I have a couple of master's degrees in linguistics from Edinburgh University and Saarland, and I'm a Latin tutor. This photo is interesting because I was paid by the Sun to dress up in blue, and then they libeled me in the press and told everyone in the world for a centerfold that I did that to myself because I really liked Avatar, the movie in particular. I really liked the language. The movie is actually quite bad. But the language was quite cool. And I wrote the dictionary for the language. And I was in charge of a fan community of 5,000 people learning how to speak Na'vi. And that's actually kind of relevant because writing a dictionary is very similar to writing an ILS in my head. It's a lot of really weird edge cases and how we're going to make this work. I'm a software developer as well. I've been a software developer for the past 12 years. Most of my actual professional work has been underneath the guise of a community manager. I hate this word deeply. I think community manager is an oxymoron. But I've been working a lot with various companies to do that. Protocol Labs, OSI, Open Source Initiative, Open Source Collective. Open Source Collective is the largest fiscal host of open source projects. I was with them for like a year. Something like 3,000 open source projects and various other places. Currently, my main work is with Sustain open source software, which we're going to talk about in a second. Why didn't I start with that? Because a lot of this talk will focus on semiotics, on linguistics, and on how I see the world because of my background. So it's kind of a bit more relevant, to be honest, than just being with Sustain. And since this is a talk to librarians or people who work with libraries or people who work with library software that then works with librarians, I got to include this slide, which I'm really excited about. I've never seen myself as a librarian before, but I've realized I've actually done a lot of work with libraries. I used to work in the University of Edinburgh Classics Library. Here's a photo of it. Back when I was there, it was a closet in the 5th floor of a tower that's now been renamed after a racist colonializer dude. And it did not look like this at all, but that's what I did. Also, the Science Fiction and Fantasy Society. Also, I set up Tiny Cat for North Branch Nature Center. I probably shouldn't admit that because I think Tiny Cat's a competitor in some ways, but I did. And I've worked with Johns Hopkins University's library and continue to work with the Library of Carnegie Mellon, although not as a direct contractor there. So I've done some library stuff. I was trying to quote Conan the Librarian here, but I'm not sure it worked. As of yesterday morning, I'm also a PhD student. I just accepted a position at the University of Wellington, Victoria, in New Zealand. So I'll be moving there in a couple of months, which will be very exciting. And I'll be working on computer science and birds. I really like birds. This is a photo I took of a silver gull when I was there last. Thanks for the congratulations. If you imagine this bird screaming into the winds, that's what I'll be doing for the next 3 years, just screaming. All right. So you've heard this term SustainOSS. It's been touted a lot in the social media. You probably saw it. Thanks for all the congrats. You probably saw it in the mailings lists and the like announcing this conference. What is it? Well, really, it's a community of people. Here's a photo of us that we met in Brussels in 2020, in February 2020, right before the end of the world. This was the 3rd or 4th conference we had. It started in 2017 in San Francisco. Then there was one in London, then Brussels, and we've had a few ancillary conferences here and there. But it's really people who met together back in 7 years ago to answer the question of how do we keep open source going? It's not an easy question to answer, and it was harder back then. A lot of people talk about sustainable open source now, which is really exciting, and we'll get more into that. But at the time, no one was really talking about the burnout problem, the maintainer problem. And so we met up, and when COVID hit, we knew that another conference wasn't come. So we took a lot of the work that we did in these one-day conferences and put them online in working groups. And I was the main person who helped out with organizing these working groups, been one of the core organizers for all the events. And also we decided, hey, let's do a podcast. That sounds fun. There's actually a couple of podcasts, but we figured let's do at least one of them called the SustainOSS podcast. After a few episodes, my co-host decided, you have the voice for it, Richard, and you're better at it than we do, which I don't know why they said that. And so they gave it to me, and I've been the main host now. I've hosted over 300 podcasts talking exclusively about open source and exclusively about what does it mean to keep open source alive? What does sustainable open source mean? Hundreds of guests, really, really fun. There's been a couple things on open infrastructure. There's a lot of stuff on open science, but in general, it's open source. So I bring this up largely because this is where most of my data is coming from. The mental model that I'm using for understanding the world has been really informed by these conversations. And in as much as I know anything about what it means to sustain open source, in as much as there's any reason for me to stand here and talk to you today, it's because I've sat on a lot of conversations and started them all with, hello, welcome to the Sustain podcast. Hopefully in a normal voice. I just realized I can't tell. Can you see my face? Or am I making faces for no reason? Yes. Excellent. Thank you. In that case, I will try not to grimace as much as I have been. We have this definition on the website, sustainers. It's mainly led by Justin Dorfman. Justin was one of the co-organizers. He's great. Thank you, Blake. You're amazing. And the sustainers was defined as the individual or organization who's concerned with the current state and future of highly used and impactful open source projects. This was a really interesting definition and a really interesting term because it was an attempt to try to figure out who is the sustain community. I really don't like this definition because I think it narrows us down. It doesn't talk about a lot of things. And so I've been wondering a lot more, what does sustain actually mean? And is this a good definition for the kind of people in our community? Could we have a better one? And that's kind of what we're going to cover today. I was thinking a lot over the past few months on what I wanted to talk to you about. I'm not a really experienced librarian. Like I said, I've worked with libraries, but I haven't, worked in a library per se. I don't go in and talk to people all day. And I haven't really built a library database. So I'm going to cover what I know, which is what sustainable means in various contexts, what you should hear when you hear the word sustainable, what open source is, which is not an easy question to answer, why it's hard, and what comes after we know those things. If you're in an open source project, which you all are, some of this will be very blazingly obvious to you. My hope is that some of it is new, and my hope that it's interesting. Again, I don't know what else to say. I didn't want to talk down to you, so I'm just going to try to talk about what I know. So those are the things we're going to cover today. So first off, when most people hear the word sustainability, they probably think of something like this. Cows hanging out underneath the solar panels. This comes from an excellent commercial called Dear Alice. It's a yogurt commercial. They made a solar punk yogurt commercial. It's my favorite thing because it visualizes what a happy future would look like, which is rare in today's climate. I don't need to tell any of you that. On the left, we have Monk and Robot. It's another awesome solar punk. I think it's going to be a trilogy. I'm not sure the third book has come out yet. If you haven't read Monk and Robot, they're very, very easy reads. They're by Becky Chambers. I love them deeply and deeply, so do check it out. And this is kind of what people think about when they mean sustainable, right? They mean carbon offsets, environment. But then when we talk about sustainable open source, we often mean something else entirely. Cozy sci-fi is an excellent term. It's kind of like cozy fantasy. Boneyards and Book Dust. I forget Book Dust. There's another series that's really fun that I also like. Okay, so where does sustainability apply in FOSS? Well, here are the different aspects that I think it mainly talks about, the different facets. So projects, that's the one, Legends and Lattes. Travis Baldry is a genius. Projects, developers, communities, businesses, academia, ecosystems, and environment. We're going to go through each of these. On the right, you'll see some lovely green shoots. I took this a couple of days ago. These are ramps. If you don't know what ramps are, they are a native allium here in New England. I'm calling today from Montpelier, Vermont, and our ramps just came out and I had them on pizza. They're delicious. And I wanted to say that sustainability in FOSS is kind of like an onion. So we're going to go from the lowest part, the projects, all the way up to the environment. Just think of it as an onion. We're going to slowly peel it back. Yes, ramp pesto is the best. Go now if you have the chance. If you're in Europe, Ramsons are coming up, which are similar. So FOSS projects, when you think about sustainability and sustaining FOSS projects, you often have these three terms in mind: growth, diversity, funding. My door just blew open. 1 second. Thought that was closed. Yes, leaks is another term. Winooski is the Abenaki term. I'm on Abenaki land right now. So growth means more in than out. That's pretty obvious. It means a pathway to maintainership. A lot of times what we see in projects is a lot of emphasis on having first-time contributors, on having first issues, good first issues. And that doesn't mean anything if you don't have a pathway to make those people become maintainers in order to allocate them power in your project. So having a decent pathway generally means having good enough governance to be able to deal with the fact that you want to take newcomers and turn them into old comers. That takes time and effort, but it's necessary for growth because some people fade away and some people continue. Generally, that means you need to have product management and design planning. You need to figure out what your project is and how it's going to work. And the goal is capturing some share of the market, hopefully the largest share. Not all the time. Some people are just happy with a single small project, but most people, when they talk about sustaining open source, mean they want to grow. This on the right is from the 2022 community report from Evergreen. So you may recognize that. Those are new libraries that came on. Some of you may be from those libraries today. If so, welcome. Congratulations. Still looking for the 2023 and 2024 report. I'm sure they'll come out at some point. So we know what growth means, and you're already on that, which is excellent. It means diversity. So welcoming community spaces, making sure that people feel that they're here and that they're welcome, that this is their place. That is awesome. This week is amazing. Great. COCs, codes of conduct. I'm really glad to hear that we have one here. Codes of conduct are really important. They are completely and utterly useless. They are worse than useless if you don't have governance structures to back them up. You can't just slap a code of conduct into a project and expect it to live. You have to have a code of conduct committee who's able to deal with things. I've also heard the COCs are useless in some senses if they're entirely judgmental as opposed to helping up beforehand. There's a term for this and I'm forgetting at the moment. Some of you already know it. But they should also be teaching experiences as well to help people learn what goes in your community. Documentation is really important for community because documentation allows people to take the knowledge that's in their heads and put it into your heads. It also enables people who don't have the time zone or the access or the internet to be in, say, the main calls. Moderation is important. Mentoring is important. None of that should be new or surprising. And the goal is to get towards some awesome ethical pie in the sky, pie chart in the sky destination, right? DEI work is never finished. One of the long-standing jokes in the Sustained podcast is that every single episode basically ends with, well, the problem is capitalism. How do we fix it? So knowing that, there's still stuff that we can do. These are some of the things that you can do. Another thing is funding. This is actually the form from Evergreen. I blocked out some stuff because no one needs to be doxxed today, but this is publicly available online. You can just look it up. And, you know, I'm glad Evergreen has this because it shows that it's a mature project. Funding needs to go somewhere. It needs to enter a bank account. There needs to be a structure by which that funding isn't in one person's bank account in a Father Ted-like experience, but much more actually, you know, with good governance and a good strategy. And you need funding for all sorts of things, for the project cost, hopefully for core maintainers. I saw that the majority of commits were made by a single person. I'm forgetting his name at the moment, but hopefully that person is funded. For some projects, it just means lifestyle funding. A lot of open source projects just want to actually, might have been Galen, yes. A lot of open source projects just kind of are made by one person who just wants people to afford their lattes in Thailand. That's not a joke. I've met those developers. And that's the thing, right? And then there's funding for all the contributors, which is another option, which is much harder to do. How much do you fund the person who does one issue, the person who does one documentation thing? I don't know. But funding multiple contributors is important, and not just code contributors, right? And we also want to fund documentation contributors. We also want to fund people who are designers. And then, of course, there's also non-fiscal sponsorships, which are also kind of funding. If Google gives you a lot of access to, say, a free Google Plus suite or something, that's coming at their expense, and funding can help with that. Funding has a lot of different aspects to it. Sometimes it's actually more about the partnerships than the funds. But this is what we think about when we think about sustaining a project. Part of that, maybe this was actually more granular than a project, but sometimes if you have many projects, it's one person, is sustainability of open source means sustainability for the developers involved with open source. And I'm using a large tent developer here, coders, designers, what have you. But for each of these people, everyone involved in the system, even awesome, truly incredible moderators of keynotes on random conferences like this one, you're amazing. You want to make sure that you're satisfied, that there's satisfaction in the job. You want to make sure that you have a career trajectory, that you're not just going to be opening PRs forever, but eventually merging PRs. You want to make sure that mentoring is happening, that you both have mentors and you have mentees. Obviously funds, we just talked about that. Recognition is awesome. And for a lot of open source, burnout. Burnout's really hard because open source projects are free to give away, but then people can complain and then you're stuck dealing with their complaints and it's really hard to say no. And it's hard to hear those things all the time when you just wanted to make a cool project. This is a non-trivial issue. If any of you know about the XZ problem recently, XZ, where one developer was getting tired and someone else says, hey, I can take it over. And then that person ended up being a state actor from China and introducing I believe that's the case, introducing a exploit. And that exploit affected the whole ecosystem for a while. And it happened because someone was burning out. Sometimes it just means having a chair. This is an Eames chair from Herman Miller. They're the best. I have an imitation over here. It's not real. But you know, a lot of people don't realize that you can actually just ask for a chair if you only have $1,000 for your project. And so I always throw this in here. Sometimes being satisfied is just like, hey, I need a new keyboard because I'm having RSI. So that's the thing. I'm loving the side chat, by the way. Thank you all for making me feel like I am welcome. I went to a conference once and gave a talk, and I had no feedback because I couldn't see the chat, and no one asked any questions. It was a bad day. But not today. Boss communities is basically the same. Not always tied to a project, but it's functionally similar to what we talked about above. Every single person needs to feel recognized and loved. It's just at scale. So multiple chairs, right? So also important. There are probably some other edge cases where communities are slightly different. Things like diversity, but I feel like we already covered those. So I'm not going to repeat myself here. And then there's open source. That's FOSS, like corporate. There's actually a whole community called COSS, the commercial open source software that I find really weird and almost predatory. And then there's LF, which is talk openly, develop openly. This is from the To-Do group. The To-Do group is the largest group of open source program offices, which are offices within a large corporation or a medium corporation that help manage the open source strategy for that organization. And this one is run by LF. LF is a nonprofit as well. I believe it's a 501c6. But they're very invested in corporate partnerships, and this is one of the communities they run. And what's hard for me about corporate and business open source is that there's always a bottom line. It's really easy for Google to lay off half of its open source office because they're not getting the returns they want, because it's hard to track returns. It's hard to track the metrics, code that you are forced to give away in order for it to be open. A lot of sustainability means making sure that you are cash positive. This can happen. There are organizations that are cash positive. I actually think Evergreen is probably a good example. It's not like this is a side project anymore. But you're not corporate in the same way though, right? You're a charity, which is great. These are LLCs, incorporated, et cetera. Sustainability often means not taking too much of the engineer's time, not pushing open source into the employee's private time, except maybe Friday afternoons when they can wear their Hawaiian shirts. And it often means you need to have advocates and marketing inside the company for open source, which affects the open source in the long run. There's a lot of questions on how much influence open source corporations have on open source projects by coming in saying we need this feature and we're going to give you 10 devs to do it. That changes the community. I'm sure you all know about this, but it's something. I put the word collaboration in quotes because the majority of the times I've talked to open source businesses and corporations with whom I've worked many times and with whom there are amazing, awesome people. Some of my favorite people are sitting in big chairs in big places doing awesome stuff, or actually sitting in their homes working for cool companies and just getting paid really well. I often hear the word collaboration, and I often hear that word used as an end in itself, but I think the focus is still the bottom line most of the time for someone. But this is what sustainability in corporations look like. Then there's academia. Academia is kind of industry, and it's kind of not. It's like its own thing. Libraries are also kind of their own thing. If I knew more about libraries, I'd have a FOSS in libraries slide. But civic, I guess. Academia is interesting. One of the major differences is reproducibility is important for academic open source. You have to make sure that the code can be redone for science. Citations and alt metrics are really important for academic open source. This is the start of a whole movement called RSE. Thank you, Chris. Which is research software engineers, which is the idea that we should start actually praising and paying and recognizing coders whose main job it is to help science by keeping open source packages alive. Things like Plotly, things like D3, things like Matplotlib, SciPy, all the awesome scientific software are plot. There's all sorts of cool stuff. But if they don't get citations, often they aren't recognized by tenure boards if you're an RSE. And people are like, well, where are your journal articles? And it's like, well, no, my code's used by millions of people. It's like, well, that doesn't matter to us. So citations and all metrics are important when we talk about sustainability in open source academia. There's another issue with academia is that a lot of it's tied to funding cycles. A lot of it's tied to projects that have funding for a short amount of time for a lab. There's also the student side of academic open source when students develop stuff or there's coursework given to students. I'm not experiencing echoing. Interesting. Those like another problem. And then there's where the support comes from in the institution is really, really important. So this is relevant to me largely because of Curious, which is a community for university and research institutions of open source software, which is a community that I've been helping run for the past year. It's nascent. To help organize OSPO's open source program offices in universities themselves, where they all meet together and we talk about how we can support RSEs, research software engineers, students, scientists, collaboratives, industry ties into academia. How do we support all that? And where you put your OSPO is really, really interesting. Because if you have your open source program office in the university in the library, it's very different than a open source program office in the CS department. And it's very different than a center of excellence. And it's very different than something coming out of tech transfer, one of my least favorite words. So that's kind of something to think about when you think about academic open source. In the sense of, is it being supported by the university itself and where is that being supported? And when you talk about sustainability of open source academia, this is kind of what I think about. And then there's ecosystem level stuff. I assume many of you have seen this comic. This is the infamous T2347 comic, the Nebraska comic from XKCD, where all modern digital infrastructure, and then there's that one little thing made by the person who's doing the one little project's been maintained thanklessly since 2008 in Georgia. So this is like what I think about when I think about sustaining open source. I don't necessarily think about a single project. Some people come to me and say, hey, can you help me with my single project? And I'm like, no, I kind of think about the whole thing. And I'm thinking about that little bit. So how do we fund maintainers for their work at scale? How do we make sure that maintainers are getting paid and remunerated for their action? How do we do that without involving corporations that are tied to the bottom line, without involving a government infrastructure like the Sovereign Tech Fund, which is great, but it's German. And that's not a problem. It's just it's tied to German voters, right? And like America, XZ is a perfect example of the all modern digital infrastructure. Other examples are Heartbleed. That was one of the main ones that went down. There's probably a few more. So security and supply chains are a lot of what people talk about here. It's increasingly the buzzword in all the conversations I'm seeing with governments, with militaries, people like CISA, talk to them about this, not very much, but a tiny bit. And large companies. Hey, how do we make sure that our software stack is secure? As if hardening was a binary action. And how do we make sure that the dependencies are, the supply chain, which are very different metaphors they're mixing all the time. How are these good stuff? Another point is the digital commons. We can see all of open source code as being a commons that's digital that we all use together. The photo in the background is of Arthur's Seat in Edinburgh, Scotland, and you will notice it is not a healthy landscape. It is entirely grass and gorse. Why is that? Well, because it hasn't been well managed for the biodiversity that should be there. It used to be back when it was a hunter's park, back when only the king had access, which isn't great either. But then it was just used for general grazing, and it led to the desolation that we see today. It's a lot more complex story to that. And in fact, the tragedy of the commons has been the term that most people refer to when I think about a digital commons, has been widely disproved as actually not being a tragedy of the commons and much more a tragedy of people who aren't thinking together about what's going on. But that's a bigger conversation. I could give a whole talk on that. This is what I think about when I think about what do we do to sustain FOSS ecosystem. I should also mention at some point, you notice I'm using the word FOSS. I could also use the word FLOSS, free and Libra open source software, or free and open source software, or just open source software. For those of you who know, I know too. Cool. And then there's more stuff around the ecosystem. So a lot of questions around what is open source and how do we stop open source licenses from proliferating, from everyone making their own bespoke license and passing it off as open source. This is a good example of open washing, where someone will say, hey, this is an open source license, great. And then it's like, well, actually, it says right here that all your bits belong to us. That's not open source. And it's like, oh, yeah, sorry. That happens a lot. And then there's patent issues, which are a whole different thing than licensing itself. But how do we understand as a community, as a global community of practitioners working on code that underpins our entire digital infrastructure, legality? I don't know, but there's only like 30 people in the world to talk to about that. So that's a really interesting question I think about a lot for the ecosystem. What do we do with legal stuff? That's even more important for AI, of course. Is AI open source? And it's also really important when we think about, say, should we be taxing people so we can pay for the roads and bridges that we all drive on, meaning the internet that we all use? Should Amazon have to pay a tax because they use the internet? Should Google? And what does that taxation look like? And how do we fund maintainers? And how do we do it in a way that isn't just, here's $5,000, now fix all the problems? Don't know. The CRA is a really good example of this that's recent. CRA has now been passed. It's the Cyber Resiliency Act. It's in the EU, and it's going to mean that it's much harder to publish open source software as an independent developer or as a medium-sized company, because you have to maintain a certain level of security. Who manages that? I don't know. This photo on the right is a really good example of another metaphor for this. This is from the Sovereign Tech Fund. I briefly alluded to them earlier. They're a German tech fund of like $10 million to help out open source digital infrastructure. Very exciting, very, very cool. And they use this logo probably in the direct reference to this comic. I'd be shocked if that wasn't the case. So that's kind of cool. Ecosystem at large. This is what most of the conversations I focus on are about. But then again, the ecosystem is only as important as the substantive parts, right? You can't have a healthy ecosystem if every single project has no code of conduct. So at some point you have to talk about the small projects all the way up to the big projects. But then you have issues at scale, which are different issues, ecosystems. I saw this. Thank you for liking all your bits are belong to us. I saw this graffito in Portland when I was at the Free and Open Source Software Yearly FOSSE conference run by Software Freedom Conservancy. Who will stop ChatGPT? I thought it was excellent. I didn't know how to source this appropriately, so I'm just going to say it came from a dumpster in Portland. And it's a really interesting question, right? And it's really interesting that this is being graffitoed. Graffitied? Graffitied. Answers in the chat. Then there's the other part of environment, right? So yes, really good quote in the chat right now about Apache and a lot of other foundations working together to figure out how to build compliant cybersecurity processes. There are people working on this, and those people are awesome. Those people also work at large consultancies like Apache, which is have a lot of people. It's a large company. So it's always interesting to me to see who's in those community decisions, who's talking to the White House about their year of open source, that sort of stuff. So when we talk about sustainability, we often have to talk about the environment too. And none of the previous things I've mentioned have talked about the environment, but this is something else that I think about when I think about what is sustainable open source, right? And there's some really good answers, like open source hardware is awesome. That's also like another thing that you can do with open source. And it's interesting because it goes straight on to storage centers and reducing server costs and reducing waste. If you can have your own, if you can hack your heart monitor, so you can change it yourself if you have access to the code that's running your heart monitor, that makes a better world, right? That's makes less waste because you're able to change the thing without having to go get a surgery and all the cost added onto that. So really, really interesting stuff around environmental open source. I'm trying to start a podcast on this, but it's been quite slow. I don't know why. But I'm excited about this aspect. A lot of people talk about carbon neutral data storage centers. I've seen Open UK spend a lot of time on that. Reducing server costs is another thing. There's a couple organizations dedicated towards using memory safe languages, or reducing the cost, like the Green Web Foundation, reducing the cost of the internet itself, which is actually now a large country, or the cost of Bitcoin, which we all know is a horrible, horrible thing. And one of the ways you can be more sustainable is to not use Bitcoin, which is really great. And then another way you could be more sustainable is avoiding the conference trap, which is I have an open source project. I don't know how to fund the project. Maybe I'll have an annual conference somewhere and everyone will fly to that conference and pay $600 and I'll use that to fund my nonprofit for the project, which is just no one actually needs to spend that carbon, which is why I'm really glad to be saying this from my home today, which is nice to be here remotely. So this is great. So yes, that is your calendar at the bottom, which is nice. And then there's the whole environment, which is a bit different. There's more stuff than that, which is sustainability involves tech for environmental activists. On the right, you have a really awesome project called Tech for Forests, which is trying to figure out what tech activists actually use in the Amazon to defend the rainforest. There's a few other things like this, like digital democracy, that go around and fund things like sneaker nets to help track illegal logging. Love that. Tech for environmental studies itself, which is actually very similar to the dependency academic stuff we had earlier. If every single environmental study using ggplot, then we should fund ggplot because it's useful for the environment and it's important for us to save the planet to fund that. So awesome. Use tech for the planet as a whole. That'd be great. Lots of aspects there. But at this point, every single time you hear the word sustain, you must be like, wait, which aspect am I talking about? Project, the environment, the business, corporation, academic, the amount of podcasts I host where I'm like, hey, we're here to talk about open source software and we can focus on this really small bit is like brutal. It's brutal because sustainability is overused. It's overused everywhere. You can see McDonald's saying they're sustainable, right? And it's semantically bleached. This is a good photo of Lithophyllum carpophyli, which is a kind of stone. It's a stone coral. It's bleached by the sun. I thought that was great. And so what do we do when we talk about sustainability? How do you reference things? I don't know. But here are some questions that can guide you when you have to ask these questions, right? For what is it sustainable? For who is it sustainable? For how long? From what original state are we sustaining things? Like tomorrow's, like when we fix things, or yesterday? And why are we using this term at all? I'd actually like a good time check. I know it's 11:47. When am I supposed to end this? How much more time do I have?
So we do have our session starting at noon Eastern.
Okay.
So if you need to go a little bit longer, that's fine. I'll still be here. But
no,
yeah,
I can do
just
it.
giving you some time.
Okay. So I'll probably try to wrap up in the next 5 minutes or so. Thank you. So the problem is that sustain isn't a very useful term. It covers all sorts of sins. So sustaining a project doesn't say that it was healthy to begin with. It doesn't say that people were treated well. It doesn't say that anything was ethical about the project to begin with. We could all sustain OpenAI, but should we? And it doesn't cover all the other stuff we talked about above, like everything. You can have a sustainable project without having a COC, but should you? Like, these are interesting questions for me. And so what does sustain mean anyway? Well, it's temporal. Great. It means keep things going as it is, but this totally ignores the minutiae that are important around open source projects. Could ignore software projects with the end of life cycles. Everything will eventually fade away as far as a project ecosystems change. And then the projects themselves, need to die and other ones come on that are a bit better, and that's fine. So not every project should be sustained. It doesn't also track fads, right? Should we sustain Bitcoin or now Ethereum or now this other cool crypto? I don't know. Sustainability doesn't really help you have insight into that problem. It just means keep it going. This was supposed to be a tulip. It turns out I've taken no photos of tulips in my life, which is surprising. So it's an assertion. But I was trying to reference the boom and bust tulip Dutch thing. So in summary, sustain fails to recognize current achievements, creative output, and the bigger picture. This is important, because sustaining stuff doesn't mean we want to keep this person on. It just means the project as a whole. So every single time you use the term, you have to like specify what you're doing. And then there's the much bigger picture as well, which is that life on Earth is dying. Things are okay for some of us, but not all of us. And eventually the Earth is going to die anyway. So sustaining a project forever is impossible. You have red azolla at the bottom there. At some point in the Eocene, this was such a successful plant that it permanently cooled the Earth. And this may come back in the future and be the only thing around. And that's the timescale at which we can think about sustainability for open source, which is, it doesn't really matter. And then the much, much bigger picture is part of that, of course, the emotional picture is that every piece of software you love will die. This is a bald cypress forest. They're all dead. That's an evergreen plant. Just to hit home a bit harder. So too much. It's like the monkey in Emperor's New Groove. Let's zoom back a bit. Let's go back. Okay, what do we mean by open source? Right? What does open mean when we talk about open source? Well, it means one of these two things. It means you have an open license or you have open methods. Okay, well, what's going on with license? Generally, if you have open source, you have a license approved by the OSI. Evergreen, as you know, as a GPL license, excellent. That is open source. That is approved. But then what about other licenses like ethical source? Ethical source licenses are licenses that you can put on your project that say, don't use this for genocide, right? Really important, but that violates one of the OSI's 10 defining terms of what it means to be open source. So is it open source? Well, only if you view open source as a big tent, all the open people working together, right? Here's a big tent. There's Organization for Ethical Source. So that's kind of more towards the methods side, right? Open source is a verb, not just a noun. Well, it's not a verb. Open source means you have the license on it. But no, you know what I mean. It means like having PRs on GitHub. Okay, cool. Right? It's methods, the open methods that we all work together on. But that means that these things are also open source, right? Antitrust maneuvering is open source. Open washing is open source. Avoiding sign-off from bureaucrats is one way to get open source projects through, right? That way you don't have to deal with it. It's just, it's in the open. We're working on it together. Or just taking code and putting it over the wall with a license and saying, I'm done now. Bye. So these like aren't open source, but they are open source, right? It's, I don't like these. And then there's nuance. A lot of the photos I've been using are from iNaturalist. My photos on iNaturalist. And iNaturalist is open source, but it says right here, it's open source for the sake of transparency, to take advantage of stuff for free of open source projects. And so volunteers can help out, but not so you can fork and clone it. Like, don't do that. Like, it's not made for that. And is that open source? Yeah. Yeah, sure. It's not great, but like, I get it. It makes sense. I think Evergreen actually falls into this camp too. Like, it's there, it's useful, we're using it, working on it together, but it's not something that other people can just say, well, we don't like that direction, let's go this way easily. But there's always nuance up and down the stack, right? Every single construct is leaky. The map is never the territory. So not all open source communities are the same. Not all open source is the same. Not even all open is the same. These are 4 images generated by Midjourney when I gave it the prompt open. Midjourney has stolen art from millions of artists because they're like, well, legally, it's only used for training. We're not doing anything with it. So legally, it's fine. And even if it wasn't fine legally, it doesn't matter because by fiat, the companies that do large AI have set up giant bank accounts to deal with the legal implications. If they get sued, they have a fund for that to deal with the lawyers, which sucks. That sucks. I will not be using Midjourney for the rest of these slides. I was only using it to belabor at this point that not all open is the same. It's the same with all of Copilot, right? Let's just scrape all of GitHub regardless of content because we're just building a model. We're not using it and releasing it. It's like, okay, someone's got to fix that. The OSI is working on that, by the way, which is really cool. They're working on an OpenAI definition. It isn't there yet, though. Hopefully we get there soon. I'm sorry to those of you who are offended by including computer-generated images from Midjourney. So, in essence, is a project OSI approved? Yes or no? That's how you tell if it's open source. But there's nuance. Why is there nuance? Because this guy stinks. This is Ferdinand Saussure. He's the inventor of semiotics, and he had these 2 ideas of denotation and connotation. You can tell by his little mustache, not a great guy. I love mustaches, by the way. I'm just saying this guy's mustache. Denotation is the thing in the world that you're pointing at when you make a reference to something. Connotation is all the extra stuff that comes along. So denotation is when you say open source, it's the OSIs. The OSI is open source. Connotation is, well, open methods, all the other stuff. Yeah, it kind of works. That's what I mean by open. Yeah, it's open. The door's open, right? So these quote as two different things, always kind of conflict. And it's why we have a problem defining what open means, and it's why we have a problem defining what sustainable means. So I've just said everything is useless. Words have no meaning. Well, no, words do have meanings. It's just that each time you use a word, it depends upon the shared context, values, and the authority that you're referring to for what that meaning is. So when you're talking about sustainable open source, when you're talking about open source, when you're talking about libraries, when you're talking about library systems, you have to think about who is the other person? What do they value? What are they valuing in here? And what's the authority that I'm referring to when I talk about anything that says we can point to this? Here's a picture of Scrabble. I hate Scrabble. It's like my least favorite game because I realize it puts all of its authority in a dictionary, which are mortally flawed products. Ugh. Talk about this with me later. I'd be happy to rave about Scrabble. So that's hard work. Why would I do that work of trying to figure out what people are defining every single time? Because these things matter, even if the world's going to die in a heat death, right? Humans matter. Animals matter. Acting cooperatively is important. Being egalitarian is important. Being meaningful, understanding the meaning in life, building the meaning in life, and mitigating and reducing pain and suffering for the Buddhists here as well. All these things are important. Kate, I'm happy to play you later. So instead of saying sustain or open, or we have to be more open, or we have to be more sustainable, think about these questions. These are the questions I think matter a whole lot more, which is, does my personal development, my project, all these things, does my business as Evergreen contribute to the happiness of myself and others? Does it recognize, validate, and protect basic living rights, like being able to access a book? Does it reduce harm by allowing people on the streets to be able to have a place to spend the day? Does it increase the capacity for wonder, awe, and joy by providing access to the entirety of human literature and music? I would argue that you're doing a pretty good job, which is great. And I wish every project had this answer and asked these questions. If any of these questions aren't being answered, you should stop what you're doing immediately and go for a walk. But the hard thing is that asking questions is easy. What's difficult is improving on them. And so my open question to all of you is, how are you measuring that? How are you measuring joy and wonder and impact? And are you doing it in your project? And are you doing it in your governance structures? Those are things that I don't think people think about enough when I think about open source. They say open is enough, and open isn't enough. You have to think about these things. And that's kind of where I've gotten to, besides we need to fix capitalism. It's like, cool, how do we improve this for everyone? And with that, here's a bird. Thank you so much. Glad you came to my talk. And yeah, I'm here for questions, and I'll be on after, even if you have talks to go to after this.
Sorry, there actually is like a bit of a discrepancy. We do need to end this meeting in order to get the next track going.
I will be on the feed loop.
Yeah. So if everyone wants to go into networking on feed loop, I'm sure that you could go ahead and send them some questions if you have them. But thank you so much. Yeah, that was a great presentation. Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Sorry that you all have to leave. Have a good conference. Yeah.
Yay.